Okay, to say which is steel, you know, in the beginning was the word, and for Marx and Engels, the word was revolution. Right at the start of their revolutionary careers, you see them write in one of their earliest books in which they really start to sort out what their political beliefs are, the German ideology, a book I would recommend anybody reads if they really want to start to understand Marxism. They write, revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling classes cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. So right at the start of their political career, they understood that revolution was necessary not just to take away the power, the wealth, the money, the armed force of the ruling class, but actually to make people fit, to make people able to govern. This is a process they had to go through. And for Marx and Engels, the force that had to go through this process was the working class. The German ideology was also the book where they first kind of really set out how they saw the world changing through the working class. And there's a reason they say the working class and not just the people or the masses or something else. They're quite clear it's the working class that is going to change the world. Now, it's not because there hadn't been any socialists before them. There were other socialists around at the time. There had been socialists before. It's not as if there hadn't been people that saw the future of humanity as being in a more equal society in which wealth is collectively owned between people. There were other people at the time. I mean, there was utopian socialists, like a guy called Fourier, who he used to put an advert in the paper every week, who said, "Come and meet me at this cafe if you'd like to invest in my scheme for how can we create socialism." And every week he would turn up and wait, and nobody came, which is probably lucky, because I've also heard that he believed that under socialism the sea would be made of lemonade, which probably isn't very ecological, and so it's probably lucky that it never came about. But there was also somebody called Robert Owen in this country, but they had essentially moral view of socialism, which said socialism would come about because people want to have a more equal society, and anybody can believe in this, a rich person as much as a good poor person, and actually if you're rich, can you please come along and invest in our project of socialism. It wasn't really going to happen. I mean, Robert Owen did build, you know, some towns in Britain and in America, which is, you know, still lived in. They're quite substantial. They're certainly far bigger than anything built in recent years by people with such beliefs. But obviously it wasn't really a goer. You know, the rich were never really going to go for this idea of investing in socialism. There was other schools of socialism, for instance, Blanqui, who had the idea of, well, socialism is a great idea, but most people aren't really convinced of it, so we're going to have to seize power on their behalf. Marx and Engels said, no, you know, capitalism has created a situation where, for the first time, we can have an equal society. In the past, to be honest, if we'd spread all the wealth around equally, we'd all have been equally poor. But if under capitalism, you know, we now have a system where we can create enough wealth. But it's also created a class that they call the grave digger, because the working class has a number of attributes that previous classes of oppressed people didn't really have. Which is, one, well, they have a material interest in overthrowing capitalism. Obviously people in the past who were oppressed had an interest, but that's something that's shared with them. But the ruling class don't really have this interest. They're not going to invest in this project. They have a position in the place of production, though, that makes them much more important. Workers run the economy. Nothing can happen without them. Every day you go out, you know, they make the tube happen. Anything you want in your life is provided for another worker, essentially. Even the rich, they can't live without workers. Prince Charles, it seems, couldn't probably wash his teeth without a worker because he has to have it put the toothpaste on his toothbrush. They actually depend on workers, and so do we. The whole of society depends on workers. Workers can turn all the lights off now, as they did at points in the 1970s. I think when a society much more dependent on electricity. You know, I can't imagine what would happen now if they suddenly switched the lights out. People simply wouldn't leave their house, I suspect. They'd be in such a state of shock. And they're also a naturally collective class. Many classes have been oppressed in the past before, but no class is collective in the way that workers are collective. Workers are brought together to work together in big workplaces. The economy is absolutely dependent on the work of other people. And when they take action, it's collective. You can only have a collective strike. You can't have some people going on strike and some people staying at work. It has to be collective. Just as when you have a revolution, workers will have to collectivise the property. It's not like peasants in the past. You know, generally, what you have with peasants is when they rise up, they burn down the landlord's house, and then they say, this is my cow, you have to go. He takes the plough, and we divide up the land. And you can't do that. You can't do that with capitalism. You couldn't really say, you have the PC, I have the desk, and somebody else will have the car park. There was some discussion last week about, anarchist ideas and some ideas around, the idea of self-governing communities. And I don't know why, the first thought that came into my head is, I'd like to see the underground run by self-governing collectives. You'd be very annoyed if you arrived at one station and then found that the collective decided to shut it that day. The workers are naturally collective. So this is why they said workers are the grave diggers of capitalism. They have the ability, the interest to smash capitalism, and they will collectivise society because it's the only way they can run society. But then you have a problem, because also in the Germanology, further on, you'll find a quote about the condition of society. And I'll read, it's a slightly longer quote. The start of it is well known, when he says, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. And just so we all kind of understand what they're saying is, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped with ideas. So one of the many reasons that our rulers rule is because we let them. To be honest, we could get with them quite easily. Downing Street is just down there. There's more of us than there are of them. They're a very small minority in society, but actually their ideas dominate. They partly dominate because they control the media, they can control most culture, and they convince them that they should rule. But at the same time, it's not just that, it's the daily existence of most of our lives tell us that we can't rule. You go to work every day, you go to work, you're told what to do, this is apparently natural, nobody ever questions why there's no democracy in the workplace. Marx talked about the anarchy of the market and the tyranny of the workplace. The workplace and our daily lives tell us that we can't rule, that somebody else can rule, and even that our lives are governed by forces which we can't even understand. If you hear people talk about the market and the way the market rules, it's always like it's gravity or it's some kind of natural force that you can't buck. Trying to buck the market is like trying to defy gravity. You can't do it. If you get the state to try and change the market, it will get its revenge. All these forces, apparently, we're taught control our lives. So if the ruling class control ideas, how do we bring about the second part of Marx's ideas about revolution, which is the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the workers themselves? If the ruling class control the ideas of society, how is it that workers can bring about a revolution? How can this happen? And to be honest, in many ways, Marx and Engels are much vaguer about this. After the failures of revolutions of 1848, actually they went off and spent the next 15 years just writing about capitalism and dropped out of politics to a certain degree. It was much more unclear. And so that's not surprising. The revolutions they had to look at, the French Revolution, most of the revolutions of 1848 were mostly of one old exploiting class like the aristocracy being overthrown by a younger, more dynamic class like the capitalist class. And the capitalist class, even when it was young, didn't really lack in confidence. They might say, we have the Catholic Church. They say, we have Rousseau. I don't think that's much of a contest, to be honest. They never really doubted that they should rule. The revolution was just a kind of consummation of that. It wasn't until 1871 when in Paris the workers had an uprising and seized the city for 2 months, something we discussed last week, and formed the Paris Commune, that they started to see the starts of the idea of how a revolution can happen. Certainly Marx was very, very excited about the Commune. He wrote his pamphlet, The Civil War in France, which obviously we discussed last week in relation to the state and revolution, but this is the first example of working class power. They saw for the first time how a revolution might happen. Get rid of the state bureaucracy, get rid of the army, have people elected on ordinary workers' wages, all these kind of things, you know, these things were what revolution actually might look like. But then, you know, it was defeated. It was a great defeat, and there was another 30 years of relative social peace in Europe. Now, that didn't mean socialist ideas and Marxist ideas in particular didn't grow in that time. They did. In many ways, Marx's predictions were being proved right. Capitalism was conquering the world. The working class was growing enormously. And mass parties were created, mass workers' parties based on Marx's ideas, most of all in Germany, the SPD, also France, in Italy, some other countries. To be honest, the English Marxists weren't up to much cough, and they never really built a whole lot. But most of all in Germany, they built a massive party called the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. I think when thinking about literature at this time, you've always got to remember that Marxists called themselves Social Democrats. Now, that changed with the First World War, and I shan't go into why that is right now. But it can make reading literature of that period quite confusing. You're all the way through Rosa Luxemburg's Marx, certainly up until the First World War, hear her talk about social democrats, what social democrats need to do. And what she means is Marxists, what she means is revolutionaries, so you should always bear that in mind. But they built a great party, it had hundreds of thousands of members, it's like a state within a state, clubs, trade unions, newspapers, magazines, pubs, lots of pubs they owned. I mean, we run a cafe now because that's probably more in tune with the times, but they ran lots of pubs as well. It was like a little world you could live in, spend your whole life in. But it started to become conservative, and people started to say, oh, well, maybe capitalism can just evolve into socialism. Maybe, you know, we're getting bigger and bigger. We'll just continually expand, and eventually our co-ops and our trade unions will just take over. And somebody eventually dared say this, and then in the 1890s, a guy called Edward Bernstein, a guy who actually lived in England most of the time, because after years of exile, his memoirs were actually quite funny about life in England at the time. He said this: maybe we don't need to have a revolution after all. Maybe we will just evolve into socialism. Now, there was a big controversy known as the revisionist controversy, where they were condemned by all and sundry, including some people who were probably, you know, it was necessarily what they meant. You know, they were talking a slightly forked tongue, let's put it like that. But the radicals in the SPD, and in particular, to finally get round to the author of the pamphlet, Rosa Luxemburg, started to say, oh, well, actually, it's all very well these fine words, but how are we going to make the revolution come back? How are we going to push the class struggle forward? This is all very well, there's endless speeches, these elections every 4 years, you know, each time, apparently more votes brings us closer to socialism. But actually, how do we really push the class struggle forward? Because, you know, we don't think all this speechifying is necessarily doing it. And they started to say, well, oh, the mass strike, this idea that has been around for a while, that you could mobilise workers to take mass strike action and overthrow capitalism. It's an idea that actually started in the 1840s with the British workers, when people said, oh, we're going to have a holy month, we'll go on strike for a month. And eventually the government will have to give in. I mean, it didn't work in 1842, but it was an idea that has stuck around ever since. So the Hamburg organisation of the SPD, which a lot of radicals in it, asked Rosa Luxemburg to write a pamphlet on the mass strike. Now, fortunately, at that point in time, a real revolution intervened in the situation. There hadn't been a revolution since 1871, since the Paris Commune. It was the first revolution also that had taken place in what could really be described as something like an industrial society. Now, Russia wasn't a completely industrial society, it's an important fact about it. 80–90% of the people lived in the countryside and were still farmers. But in the cities, industry was growing very, very rapidly, and in many ways was more advanced than industry in the West. They didn't have to wait 30 years, 40 years, 50 years before they could build a factory like they had in the West. They could just copy it immediately. As a result, things like the Putilov works, with its 30,000 workers, were amongst the largest and most modern plants in Europe. So when the revolution exploded there, it was the first time we'd ever really seen a revolution in a truly industrial society. And suddenly we started to see how revolution might really happen. In many ways, that is the subject of the pamphlet. And the subject is the mass strike. Because actually, what she quite quickly realised, and she says right at the start of the pamphlet, is actually we've all been talking about this mass strike thing, but actually in reality, the mass strike is quite different from what we think. It's not something that can be decided by some committee or planned, or, you know, some union leaders decide it. It springs forward, springs out of the class struggle, comes out in the struggles of ordinary people. You can't predict when it's going to be because you don't know what the cause is going to be. And in chapter 3, which is probably the best place to start if you do want to read it, which is the one that is the largest chapter, it's the one where she really describes what happens in 1905 during the course of revolution, describes the wave after strike and how they affect the country. She says, you know, it wasn't like that. It wasn't planned by anybody. Most of the strikes, in the previous years, they started over small things. A pensions dispute, some wages, somebody getting sacked. And then the strike starts and it spreads and it breaks out in one. People walk out and they walk to the next factory and they say, we're going on strike. And they say, well, great, we are too. And it spreads through the countryside and goes across the country. And in 1905, this really exploded. There's a demonstration in St. Petersburg, the capital then, actually led by a priest. They marched to the Winter Palace. They said, oh, little father, the Tsar, please help us. You know, they weren't particularly massively radical in their demands. Please help us, little father. But the Tsar wasn't going to have any of it, and the troops fired it, and hundreds died. You know, you hear all kinds of figures, but certainly it was a very large massacre. The city of St. Petersburg exploded in a general strike. It was paralysed, completely paralysed for days, and it went across the country. And as the strike went across the country, it dragged more and more people in, as people realised, you know, we have power. Suddenly you hear that the capital was paralysed, other cities paralysed, the railways paralysed. Well, we can do that too. Workers that had never been on strike before suddenly went on strike. And this moved on. They put forward political demands, obviously, about the massacre. But as the strikes went on, people realised, well, actually, you know, we're on strike. Maybe we should all go on strike about wages. Maybe we should stay out. Maybe we should stay out till we get rid of that foreman. Maybe we should stay out until they produce a first children. And all through the early months of 1905, you see a wave of strikes going across Russia and across what was then the most industrialised part of Russia, Poland, which was then ruled as part of it. You see all kinds of demands being put forward. Wages, schooling. You see lots of demands that often pop up when you see big waves of strikes really happening, which is people have demands about dignity. We don't like the way the manager's talking to us. We don't like the way the foreman's talking to us. He shouldn't talk to us in that way. He shouldn't use T, which is the kind of pronoun in Russian, which is generally considered rude. You're usually children and animals. If you don't know them, you call T. So don't call us that. We want to be called the polite form. We want education in Polish. We want the managers to speak Polish, or whatever the language was in that part of the empire. You saw this massive spreading across strikes, across the thing. And of course, these strikes don't just remain just economic or political. They move from one to the other. Now, in our society, actually, you know, one of the things that tends to control us is the fact that our rulers tell us there's a difference between politics and economics. That the two don't mix and match. You know, economics has this kind of weird natural laws. The state shouldn't involve in it. Actually, the best way to run the economy is for the state not to involve itself at all in the economy. Now, that's what the Tea Party people want to think. The economy will run best if there's no taxes and the state has no interference. These are two completely separate systems. And it's also reflected in resistance. So even in the trade union movement, the Labour Party, they say, oh, you know, politics and economics, we need to keep these separate. You know, you often hear about a strike or something, you know, oh, this isn't political, this is just about wages. You know, like, you can never have an apolitical strike, because as soon as it starts winning, you quickly find the courts and the police start getting involved, which I think are both quite political institutions personally. You know, they're both very much part of the state. So on the one hand, you have maybe the trade unions saying, oh, we don't want to get involved in politics. We're not going to use strike action to change this law, because, you know, that would be undemocratic. That's politics. We're not getting involved in politics. And on the other hand, you have institutions like the Labour Party, which you supposedly represent the political interests of the working class. When there's a big strike that happens, suddenly you hear them saying, "Oh, this is just between the employer and the workers. We're not going to get involved. We don't want this to become political. They need to negotiate their way around this." Once again, you know, this is completely wrong, because the employer always has the state, the courts, the police, the banks, and everybody else behind them. All it does is it ties one hand behind the worker's back. Always, we are fighting with one hand behind our backs. Now it's today, now it's economics. Now it's economics, now it's politics. Each time, you know, we're kind of stymied in some kind of way by the fact that the ruling class in reality never, ever recognises the difference between politics and economics. They always unite them, they always bring them together. But the mass strike blows this apart. Workers, when they start to feel powerful, start to put forwards about both sets of demands. They want economic change, they want improvements in wages, they want political changes. And you see this happening all through the century. You saw this in Russia in 1905, but actually in any revolution, in any set of mass strikes, you see the same things happen. Again and again through her pamphlet, she says, one of the things she says is, you know, what happened in Russia isn't just happening in Russia because Russia is some kind of weird or backward or different. What's happening in Russia is happening because it's capitalism. This is the class struggle, and this is the product of capitalism. And it will be reproduced everywhere. Now, at the time, that was extreme prescient. She was right. She only had the example of the 1905 revolution. She only had what was going on in Russia, but she quickly predicted that this will happen. And you see it over and over again. For every revolution through the 20th century, you look through it. Just an example of, that came into my head was, for instance, the Iranian Revolution, which is also something characterised by massive strikes. And you look at, for instance, the demands of the oil workers. The oil workers go on strike against the Shah, but then they want an end to our martial law, definitely political. Freeing of political prisoners, definitely political. Or communications in the workplace to be in the Iranian Persian language. Now, is that political or is it economic? The sacking of the foreign experts that are taking the jobs that Iranians could take because they don't really trust us. Economic, political, and you go through them, and you have demands about education, children, wages. Any kind of society, east, west, developed country, backward country, you see the same thing where actually workers start to bring together these sets of demands, because once they start to feel powerful, they start to feel actually we can challenge the relations in the workplace, we can challenge that, but also we can challenge things happening outside in society. And at a certain point, mass strikes by their very nature start to challenge the very nature of power in society. Because if you think about it, everything is won by workers. What happens when they start to go on strike? Well, things start to stop. It's not the kind of thing we've seen in this country for a number of years. But actually, when you see massive strike waves like that, everything starts to come to a standstill. Now, actually, you can't have a society just come to a standstill. Things have still got to function. So who's going to decide what works and what doesn't work? Well, actually, it's the workers that run them. They start saying, well, okay, maybe we're going to make this service happen and not that service happen. Maybe we're going to make the electricity come, but we're going to turn off the television at some point. Maybe we're going to stop papers like The Sun, and this has happened in this country where printers said, actually, we're not printing that. That's disgusting. No, we're not going to print that attack on a trade union leader. You saw it in various other times. In 1968 in France, when you saw the power workers saying, "Oh, we're not going to turn off the lights, but actually we'll turn them off for an hour just to make sure you all know we can." And that starts to spread. It starts to spread. Suddenly you see other groups of workers getting involved in this. And in France, you saw the footballers taking over their own football association and saying, putting banners outside saying "football for the footballers." But the fact is, this starts to raise the question of state power. It starts to raise the question of power within society. And this tends to be brought together in an institution that we refer to as a Soviet. Because at some point, as happened in 1905, all these workers on strike said, well, instead of having like all these different strike committees to organise, we should all get together because we need something to coordinate this. This is becoming far bigger than just workers in one workplace, just one set of workers against one employer. This is starting to become about all of society. And they formed something known as the Soviet. Now, Soviet in Russian just means council. It was the Council of Workers' Deputies. And in that they were elected from the workplaces, so it's not like normal elections. You go to where you work and you elect one of your colleagues, and then he goes, and then he goes and represents you. And if you're not happy with him, you have another vote and you call him back. It's a much more immediate form of democracy. It's very immediate. It's with people you know. It's not professional politicians, and it's centred on the place where workers have their power, where workers are showing their power, and where they're changing, which is in the workplace. The Soviet brings these demands together because actually the Soviet has to deal with all these things. It has to deal with the political aspects of the struggle and with the economic aspects of the struggle. It brings these together. Now, the Soviet is not something that Rosa Luxemburg particularly mentions in her book. It's something that came out of came out of the revolution. It must be said, I mean, we could have a discussion about why she doesn't mention the Soviet, but actually if you read Lenin and Trotsky at that time, nobody really pays a whole amount of attention to it. It wasn't until much later on that people started to realise the importance of it, and specifically in 1917, when the new revolution broke up, that this time did manage to overthrow the Tsar and actually create a revolution in Russia, situation in Russia. When people said, oh, remember the Soviet, we're going to have it again. And this time it spread much more quickly through Russian society. And then actually people realised, and Lenin realised and wrote about this in his book The State and Revolution, which we discussed last week, this is actually starting to become the basis of a new society. You know, now we know what we're going to replace the state with. You know, before there was a certain kind of question. Actually, we realise now we need to smash the state, and this is what we're going to replace the state with. The second part of the equation of revolution that kind of gets filled by the Soviet is the one referred to by the mass strike, which is the fact that, you know, mass strikes change people. They change the class. So, I mean, all strikes change people. I mean, strikes isn't something we have a whole lot of at the moment, I haven't had for a number of years. But if you talk to people that have been involved in large strikes or quite long strikes, then, you know, they will really always tell you how they were changed by that experience. Because suddenly, your eyes get opened up about society. Suddenly it becomes very clear about which side people are on. Suddenly it becomes very clear which side the boss on, which side the police is on, which side the courts are on, and who's on your side, other workers on your side. It really lays open the nature of society. Lift this to a much larger level, and you see actually people being changed en masse. Actually people suddenly discussing, talking much more about the nature of society, how it can be changed. Because actually strikes have the mass strikes can transform people. They can actually make people ready to change society themselves. They make people realise the nature of class and realise the nature of society, and it makes them realise that actually politics and economics are one thing, and actually as working class people we can affect both of them. Now, if there's a weakness to the pamphlet, and you know it's a brilliant pamphlet, it's one of the best pamphlets, certainly for its length, ever written in Marxist edition, I would recommend anybody to read it. If there's a kind of weakness to it, it's the way she deals with the trade unions. Now, in many ways, the target of this book is the trade unions. I mean, there's a polemic against the anarchists, but to be honest, you know, the anarchists weren't really a major influence in the German working class at the time. Internationally, they were. In France, in Spain, in Italy, they were. But really, most of her ire is reserved for the leaders of the trade unions, who constantly, you know, they said, you know, we don't talk about the mass strike. How can you put at risk all the organisation we've spent so many years building up? You know, you'll smash everything we developed. I mean, she throws us back at them. She says you treat your organisation like it's some kind of rare porcelain, that the first kind of whirlwind of the mass strike of the revolution we smashed to pieces. This is completely untrue, she says. You know, actually, the mass strike builds organisation, and I think generally in history you also find this, that waves of strike action can be chaotic, waves of strike action can be very disruptive of organisation, but ultimately waves of struggle always build unions, and unions that don't fight, and unions that just try and keep their head down, are unions that in the long run are destined for the dustbin of history. They're not going to survive. At some point you do have to fight, because that is the nature of unions, that is the nature of the class struggle. But she very much attacks the unions and union leaders in particular for their conservatism. They've got too used to negotiating all the time. They've forgotten the end goal of this class struggle is actually overthrow capitalism. Problem is, I think she underestimates the influence of underestimates actually, or overestimates rather. Overestimates the influence of. Now I'll get this right in a minute. I've got my overestimation mixed up. She underestimates that. She underestimates the influence of trade union leaders. I mean, because in the mass strike, what she's trying to do is she's trying to show people in the very kind of staid world, the German Social Democratic Party and other reformist parties around Europe, that ultimately it's the class struggle that's going to bring down capitalism. It's the masses, it's their initiative, it's their imagination, it's their struggle. This is what's going to bring the class struggle forward. This is what's going to bring down capitalism. It's not just the endless speeches and pamphlets of election times and rallies. It's the actual real struggle of the working class. She continually emphasises the working class, the power of the working class, its spontaneity, how you can't hold back their struggle, whether you wish to or not. It will always burst forward. And she's right, at some point in time, it will always burst forward. But she underestimated the strength of the trade unions. She thinks that the class struggle, and she says it quite specifically, and if they try and stand, they'll be swept aside. And actually, when the revolution came, what he found was the state was swept aside temporarily in 1918, the army was swept aside, but actually the trade union leaders and the leaders of the Social Democratic Party and the reformist parties actually were very stubborn in the way they stuck around and actually had a lot of influence within the class. Now, towards the end of her life, she also learning, for the example of the Russian Revolution, learned that actually this is the case, and this is why you need to build an independent organisation of revolutionaries. But sadly, it was too late, and the very same people who she had argued with at the start of the century in 1918 had her murdered by right-wing thugs. And so, you know, as somebody said, you know, the greatest mind in Marxism has died. But the fact is, you know, in the mass strike and in her work, she left us an invaluable contribution. It's one of the greatest books in Marxism, and it helped finally kind of close the circle in terms of how we bring the revolution about. The revolution we brought about when workers on a massive scale move into struggle. Only a minority of people will be convinced by speeches and books and just the good idea of socialism. Once you get mass strikes, then actually you open up the prospect of millions and millions and millions of people, because they suddenly start to take action on their own behalf. And that is how we start to come towards revolution. Because at the end of the day, it is, you know, people can talk about plan Bs or alternative economic strategies or all kinds of things to take us closer to our goal. But ultimately, it is the mass strike in its transformation of its people's consciousness, and the way it makes ready the working class to rule. It's the mass strike that is actually the first step to socialism.